Should games be frustrating? We're really on like a game kick right now. That's pretty interesting. Let's see. Should... ooh, 21 minutes. Should games be frustrating? Thanks to Prime Hayden. I think so. I think there's really no satisfaction in a game if it's just like a complete cakewalk the entire time. Whether that comes through like a narrative or through a challenge, I think there needs to be something. It's like watching a movie where there's no villain and there's no problem. It's not fun.
Red Dead Redemption 2 is weird, especially for a AAA game. Where many titles in that space aim to appeal to as wide of an audience as possible, Red Dead Redemption 2 really doesn't. In a lot of ways, it's uncompromising. I'd go as far to say that it isn't even concerned with being all that fun. Of course, there is traditional video game fun to be had. We get shootouts and chases and... But between all that, there's a lot of rides across multiple state lines.
That's made most of the game.
With members of the gang. 5-hour-long animations of skinning an animal. Large portions of RDR2 are intentionally tedious. That's not to say they're bad, but the main goal of those moments doesn't seem to be traditional fun. At its best, it's type 2 fun, which is when something isn't all that much fun in the moment, but is fun to look back on. Even then, though, there are parts of the game that seem to be designed expressly to be frustrating. And no section of Red Dead Redemption 2 exemplifies this better than its 5th chapter, Guarma.
How can you see dislikes? So I think the reason I'm able to see dislikes here, I can't see them on my phone, I can't see them on my other computer or anything, but the reason I think I can see them here is because I haven't turned this computer off or even closed Google Chrome in like a month. So I don't think it's had a chance to kick through the update for this because it's still like a fucking fossil here. Or maybe it still just hasn't rolled out for everyone, but I can't see it anywhere except on this computer.
Of becoming familiar with the various territories of Red Dead's America and trying to find a foothold for the gang somewhere in it, Chapter 5 takes Arthur and a few members of the gang to an entirely new part of the world. They have a job go wrong, hop on a ship to escape, get caught in a storm, and find themselves stranded. This whole part of the game is hard to play. I don't exactly want to call it bad, but yeah, it's kind of bad. There isn't all that much to explore or do on the island, so pretty much the only option is to mainline the story missions, all of which are not super interesting. Mechanically, most of them revolve around moving from shooting gallery to shooting gallery. The non-stop combat gets exhausting pretty quickly, and on top of that, the section doesn't even have all that interesting of a narrative. The gang gets wrapped up in a local rebellion aimed at the owner of a sugar plantation, as they see it as the only way to be able to get off the island, and none of it ever really feels like it matters, because it's so separate from the world and story the player has spent the past 30 or so hours caring about. Furthermore, the members of the gang who are with Arthur are all the worst, those being Micah, Dutch, Bill, and Javier. Micah is cruel and unpredictable. Every time he deserved to be killed. Dutch has fallen deeper and deeper into delusions of grandeur and can't seem to help himself when it comes to putting the gang into terrible situations.
I would never say this is like frustrating though, it's just really fucking boring.
Edges, almost always having something to complain about. And Javier, while probably the most
I don't think boring
bunch,
equals frustrating, it just
to both
means
Dutch
boring.
And Bill, meaning he fully buys into the horrible plans that those two cook up. For folks who have played the original Red Dead Redemption, there is far more baggage here, as Dutch, Bill, and Javier are 3 of the primary antagonists. And during the time between the two
having
games,
to do boring stuff is frustrating
and unhinged, making it hard to connect to them in any sort of positive way. To be clear, I think at least in RDR2, they're all interesting and well-written characters, but I don't like being around them, and I especially don't like being stranded on an island with them. All things considered, this section only takes 2 to 3 hours to complete, which really is nothing in this game, but while playing it, I swear it felt like it took 5 times as long. At first, I thought it was a failure in the game's design. Rockstar had presented me with a world and characters that I had grown to care about a fair bit, and then they pulled me away from it all right when the tension was highest, just to funnel me through a handful of boring fights with stakes I had no connection to. And honestly, it's still hard for me to look back at that section with anything other than frustration. However, it ended up having a pretty huge positive impact on how I approached the rest of the game. Before even getting to the Guarma section, I had started to rush things a little bit. After putting in so many hours, the exploration and side activities had lost a bit of their luster. Also, I could sense the game wasn't too far off from ending. although it definitely was further off than I thought. So my natural instinct was to keep moving forward with story missions so I could see how everything would resolve. By the time I hit chapter 4,
Is it a sin?
I was ignoring
Yes,
most things
and you're
that
wrong.
didn't progress the story. And without those
if you don't like the things I like,
moments
you're
between
wrong.
missions to help recenter me,
Idiot.
a sense of more, and that sense of fatigue skyrocketed. Along with that, I wasn't even enjoying the story anymore because I didn't care about what was happening in Guarma or what stupid plan Dutch had to get us out of there. I was miserable. So when I finally got off the island, the last thing I wanted to do was
pretty
more
intense.
story missions, especially ones from a D or an M. I needed a break from the constant grind of dealing with Dutch's bullshit. So after reuniting with the members of the gang I cared about, I went off to do my own thing. I explored the land again for the fun of doing it. I met new people for Arthur to befriend. I took a breath for the first time in what felt like a dozen hours, and I started to have fun again. Mostly the Type 2 kind still, but either way, I was enjoying taking things slow again. Honestly, more than I ever had before. Chapter 6 of Red Dead Redemption 2 is all about self-reflection. It has Arthur questioning what matters, and for the chapter to work, I think it's very important for players to take
So is this all about Red Dead?
To soak in the world that is so easy to just ride through, to engage with the things that you've started to take for granted.
I don't care what anyone says. What you're seeing right here, the skinning of the animals and the extremely long, slow, tedious journeys from point A to point B make the game fucking boring. As I said, and as I will continue to say, its focus to be extremely realistic is a detriment to its overall enjoyment of the game.
Time. That is how I experienced the chapter, and it's honestly one of my favorite sections of any game ever. I can pretty confidently say that if it weren't for how much I hated playing through the one before it, I would not have approached it in the same way. Guarma made me aware of how tiring my approach to the game had become.
It's mostly about story though. True.
The pattern
story was
I had
very good.
Into. This
Characters
led to
were really
my
good.
playstyle shifting in a way that mirrored the themes being presented in Chapter 6, making everything hit harder. When looking at the use of frustration to highlight certain themes or playstyles, things get a bit murky. For starters, when looking at these moments, it can be tough to tell what is an intentional choice by developers to try to elicit a certain response from players, and what is just flawed game design that inadvertently works for some folks. Unless the devs come out and say what their intention was, it's pretty much all guesswork. Additionally, there's an argument that intention doesn't even matter, because if a player has an enjoyable or terrible time with the game due to some frustrating aspect or mechanic, the player's experience doesn't change based on whether or not it was intentional. Personally, I think intention largely matters because every developer goes in with the vision of the experience they want players to have. So if a design choice accidentally shifts that experience, even if some players view it as for the better, it is a failure of sorts. Granted, players finding unintentional enjoyment is just part of gaming, so it's not the biggest failure in the world. In Red Dead Redemption 2's case, I think Guarma's frustrating design was an intentional choice by Rockstar. Certain aspects of this are easier to support than others. Like the fact that Arthur is stuck there with Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier can't be a coincidence. Between some of them being villains in the first game and all of them being assholes in this one,
I think we're getting a little too deep. I think they just made a
players with this
No, I think they just made a boring section.
Far different if Arthur had been there with, say, Charles, Sadie, Lenny, and John. Having the characters with him all be antagonizing.
We're really getting in deep.
I also think taking away the ability to explore is meant to make players recognize how important it is to be able to wander. The section takes away player choice, which
they
goes
just
against
made a
everything
fucking
the
boring
open world
section.
has represented. While in Guarma, you're supposed to feel trapped. It's harder to determine if things like the missions being boring was an intentional choice or just bad missions, but given the pace, they seem like they're supposed to stress you out. Either way, all of this added to a mood that it seems like Rockstar will cultivate, that being an intentional feeling of frustration used to make players appreciate the slowness that is so easy to speed past. And I found it effective. But the way a lot of people talk about Guarma, I don't think everybody did. And of course, that leads to the biggest question that pops up when looking at the intentional use of frustration in games. Is it worth it? Like any creative medium, there are countless emotions games can evoke from players, and frustration is one of the most powerful that a title can tap into. For those willing to push through the frustration and come out the other side better for it, it can create a massive emotional connection between the player and the game. One of the most obvious examples of this is Dark Souls.
Okay, so let me... I do want to finish it because I'm curious what the conclusion is that he draws. There is a huge difference between the kind of frustration you experience in Dark Souls versus that dog shit section of Red Dead. In that section of Red Dead, Guarma, it is nothing but boredom. I don't think there's anyone that goes into Guarma that's like, oh my god, I'm so fucking upset because it's so goddamn hard. Oh my god, these gunfights are fucking hard. I'm really struggling. That's super different. Boredom is a totally different level of frustration than something like a challenge presents like Dark Souls. I don't think anyone would say Dark Souls is boring, therefore it's frustrating. It's more like I was getting my ass fucking pounded and it was making me mad. But in Red Dead, it's always, I was falling asleep, so I turned it off. It's super different, and I don't think it should be in the same argument. And maybe he makes a distinction, but going from this to this just doesn't really work for the overall should games be frustrating thing.
Has bred a community of die-hard fans through the shared experience of suffering. They trudged their way through trapped corridors and poisonous swamps. They clawed through each area, learning how to get past enemies without losing all of their heals. They bashed their heads against tough-as-nails boss fights that sometimes just seem unfair. And eventually, they got good. People love FromSoft not just because their games are well made, but also because players become personally connected to them. Like, I didn't know the true meaning of anger or joy until I fought and later beat Ornstein and Smo for the first time. All of those hours of frustration players put into the games are rewarded with an incredible sense of relief that is almost addictive. Folks feel linked to the various worlds FromSoft creates partially because they earned their way through them. Of course, the trade-off here is that certain players will have absolutely no interest in playing a game that's centered around being frustrating. While I generally have a high tolerance for dealing with these kinds of aspects in games, there are a handful of titles that I tried my hardest to get into but just couldn't handle. The most notable being Pathologic 2, which on paper sounds like it should be one of my favorite games ever, but in practice, it made me lose my mind. Every action I took used up valuable time or resources, and I'd go off to do something for a few hours and come back with nothing to show for it except more hunger and exhaustion. It's a game that I want to get through because I envy the way people who adore it talk about it. They hold the experience in such a high regard, and I want that feeling. But anytime I plan to boot it up, I just can't bring myself to do it, as I don't want to deal with the stress. For this reason, a lot of games that seemingly use frustration as a tool to elicit certain player responses end up being extremely polarizing. For every person who buys into the frustrating aspects of a game and connects to the material because of it, there's also someone who finds no benefit in the frustration and walks away without any meaningful payoff. And that can be a really disappointing
Death Stranding is just another one that I wouldn't put in here.
When it's a $60
it's
game
not
that you
frustrating.
Take the
due to like a challenge
when people talk about it,
design, it's boring.
Ground because it was a long-awaited follow-up to one of the greatest games of all time. And instead of scaling massive beasts in order to take them down in an epic fashion, you spend most of the game waiting for one to understand what you're trying to do.
Yeah, this game sucked. The game was trash, unfortunately.
And disobedient and often annoying. But there are these moments where your new giant pet comes through for you in a way you didn't think possible. And it just feels so good. Struggling with the messy controls and seemingly inconsistent AI is what makes The Last Guardian work, because when you figure out how to rely on Trico and have Trico rely on you in spite of all the barriers of communication that get in the way, the struggle starts to feel worth it. It's one of the few games I've played where I felt like I personally bonded with a character. Trico is my pet, and it's impossible to forget that feeling. However, many others
I forgot that feeling almost immediately.
It was a janky, dated, disappointing mess.
Yeah, it wasn't very good.
It's hard for me to say they're wrong, because I do get it. It's just that those frustrating aspects resonated with me in a way they didn't for others. The Last Guardian takes a lot of risks with its tone and mechanics, and those choices didn't pay off for a lot of people. This general philosophy applies to everything in life. Some people like stuff that others don't. Duh. But it is hard to ignore that these kinds of games evoke stronger feelings of love and hatred than ones that don't take the same risks. The most intense example of this I've ever seen came with The Last of Us Part 2. It's a title where huge chunks of people view it as one of the most meaningful games they've ever played, while many others see it as manipulative and poorly written. And certainly some takes have been made in bad faith, but obviously not all of them. The divide is massive. And when I hear people talk
why
about
would this
it,
be
it
in should
sometimes
games
sounds
be
like everyone
frustrating?
played different games. At the center of a lot of love and hate this title gets is the character Abby. And look, it's pretty much impossible to discuss this topic without getting into spoilers, so while I'm not going to ruin everything, I will be going into some major events that happened throughout. The big one being, at the start of the game, Abby kills Joel. And it was a hard moment to process.
I'm a little lost on why that would be there. I don't think at any point that game is ever like frustrating because of the game being difficult or challenging or presenting you with a problem that you can't solve without getting better, or even in Red Dead's case, giving you something that's boring that makes you frustrated. It's more just people didn't like the story, so it frustrated them. And in that case, the title Should Games Be Frustrating? I mean, there's nothing you can do to help that. Not everyone's going to like the story. It just feels like a lot of shit got put in there under frustration that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I guess I didn't finish it either, but... Okay, here, I'll just go to the conclusion. Might as well at least see what happens.
For games to include intentionally frustrating design. And of course, there are a lot of ways to look at it. I think scale matters a fair bit. For instance, the vast majority of games that center around using frustration as a mechanic are indie titles. And this largely works, as they're aiming to appeal to a niche audience who would be into that sort of thing. So in that case, the easy answer is yes. Obviously. Things get a bit muddier when looking at bigger titles, though. From a consumer standpoint, a studio putting out a game with an established fan base and then adding elements that will knowingly agitate a sizable portion of folks who buy it is a tough look. Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't draw nearly as much anger as The Last of Us Part 2, but both have.
But I don't think they did that to make people mad. They did it thinking it would help the story. They did it for their vision of the story.
And for those who have enjoyed previous work they've done, I imagine that feels bad, especially when they're spending money. From a developer standpoint, putting out a game that is the exact one you wanted to make seems incredible. Most games, especially AAA titles that cost a lot to make, have to compromise to the mass market, and to be able to break away from that is something I guess most creators dream about. Really, the success of The Last of Us and Red Dead Redemption, along with pretty much everything else Naughty Dog and Rockstar have done, made it so their sequels were guaranteed to sell well, putting both in a place where they could take risks. So it isn't a huge surprise that they did. I think if a developer has a specific vision that they want to make, they have every right to do it. But also, they have to go in with the understanding that folks who used to be fans might not be anymore. From a selfish standpoint, my answer depends on how I personally responded to any specific game in question. If it worked for me, then it was obviously the right choice. And certainly, you could measure whether or not it was the right choice based on things like retention percentages, long-term sales figures, and other statistics. But even then, there are so many different definitions of success, making it hard to fully pin down. So the answer to the question is a somewhat unsatisfying, I don't know. It depends on what's important to you. To be clear, if you think something
I kind of figured that'd be where we were going. That's where most of the game essays go.
For other players, or was an intentional choice by the developers. However, I think there's a lot of value in trying to understand why people both love and hate a specific thing, and that often takes examining those aspects. Personally, I think frustration is a very valuable tool, and I'm interested to see developers continue to experiment with incorporating it, as it can create such a powerful connection between the player and the game. I just hope that the next game I play that uses it works for me.
So, in the entire list, there's only one game here that I feel fits this argument of should games be frustrating, and it's Dark Souls, because Dark Souls is made to frustrate you, the player. Every decision it makes with its enemies, its move types, what you have available to combat it, is there to be a tough game, which is thus going to frustrate people. Red Dead 2, I don't think they made that mission to piss people off. Last of Us 2, they didn't make those story decisions just to make people mad. They did those things because, in Guarma here, Last of Us 2, they didn't make those story decisions just to make people mad. They did those things because, in Guarma here, they thought it was good for the story, and in Last of Us 2, they probably thought it was good for the story. The only game here that actually made decisions to be frustrating is Dark Souls, and it worked. So I don't know, I just feel like a lot of different stuff got thrown in here that doesn't really fit. And getting over it, but that wasn't like a big portion here. Trico from Last Guardian, that game just didn't work, so it was frustrating. It wasn't like they tried to make the game not work, so that doesn't fit either. Like, there's only one thing here that had a sizable chunk, which is Dark Souls, where it is genuinely made to frustrate people. That was a little confusing. But someone asked in the chat what the most frustrating game I ever played was, or like what the hardest one was, and I have an answer. It's gonna be one no one's expecting, and I can promise that. The Samurai Jack game. The Samurai Jack game on Steam was the hardest and most frustrating game I've ever played in my life. I played through initially on hard mode, and the controls don't really work, or at least they didn't at launch. So when you'd roll, you'd have like a full second of input lag before you could do another action. And you'd die in 2 hits to even normal mobs. It was the most brutally difficult game I've ever played. I played Wanna Be the Bashi, Wanna Be the Guy, Dark Souls, my favorite series, Souls games is my favorite genre, and no game is as hard as Samurai Jack was on launch on hard mode. Nothing else even came close. It was the most frustrating game I've ever played. Fucking hated it. It was rough. I don't know if they ever fixed it, but it was miserable. You're stuck on one level for over an hour? I was. It wasn't even a boss. It was a level where you're just supposed to go through trash mobs. It was like 3 waves of trash mobs. But like I said, you die in 2 hits, and anytime you try and do like a roll, you have a full second of input delay before you could react. So if I'd roll, I'd insta-die because I wouldn't be able to react to the attacks that would follow. It was fucking awful. It made me so mad. And blocking, I don't even remember if there was blocking, to be honest. There might have been a parry system instead of blocking. I don't remember. It's been like 2 years now, but god, that shit was truly miserable. Thanks to resub Reese's Pieces. Oh, Reese's Pieces. Have you seen the new court cam? Yeah, we caught up last time. You should try watching the greatest speedrunners you've never